Hello and welcome back to 10-Minute Elections. Today is Monday, June 22nd, 2020, and since it's been a while since I've done one of these videos, I thought it would be a good time to loop back around and cover an overview of the 2020 electoral map as of today, June 22nd. So I've already filled in safe states for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and noticed that since I made my last full election overview, New Mexico has moved into the safe column for the Democrats, and South Carolina has moved away from the safe column for Republicans. So for these projections, I use a variety of sources: JHK, polling data, demographics, trends, voter registration, everything I can find. So I'm attempting to get everything I can to make these projections as accurate as possible. So let's just start out west with the competitive states and move east here. The first state we are going to be discussing is Nevada. At this point, Nevada has moved further to the left recently. Its demographic trends are somewhat similar to Arizona's, and at this point, although I was not in the last video like this, I am comfortable enough now with Nevada to categorize it as a likely state. Arizona, I've gone into a lot of detail about Arizona in previous videos, so I'm not going to as much today, but basically all the younger voters, all the new Hispanic voters, and the rapid diversifying and blue trend of Maricopa County indicate that Arizona should be classified somehow favorably to Joe Biden, and in my case, the polls indicate that it should be a lean state. Colorado, this was a Bush state, it's a blue state now, and it's a state that John Hickenlooper should be the likely Democratic nominee for the Senate race, and is heavily favored against Republican incumbent Cory Gardner. So I'm going to mark this one as a likely, and it should be safe in another election, especially if Trump wins in 2020. Moving down now to the state of Texas, state where Beto O'Rourke nearly unseated incumbent Republican Senator Ted Cruz back in 2018, although MJ Hegar doesn't have as much of a chance this time against incumbent Republican John Cornyn in the 2020 Senate race. Donald Trump is pretty deeply unpopular in Texas, and this is a state with a very strong libertarian and independent presence, certainly. I think Democrats are probably one election cycle away from making this state a toss-up, but certainly this is far from a safe state for the Republicans. I'm going to leave it as a lean for now, although that could certainly change. Moving up now to Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, which I had previously characterized as a lean Republican. This is a state that JHK actually projects to go to Biden by about a point. So I'm actually going to leave the 2nd Congressional District of Nevada as a toss-up for right now. It's not going to be too important, seeing as this map is pretty favorable to Joe Biden. But if Donald Trump can come back from the low point he's at right now, and the only states Joe Biden manages to flip from 2016 Clinton are Michigan and Pennsylvania, then the 2nd Congressional Districts of Nebraska and Maine would decide the election. Moving east, let's look at the state of Iowa. This is a state that I had previously rated as likely and said it would become safe decently soon. But Joni Ernst has become so unpopular in Iowa that the race is now virtually a toss-up for Senate. JHK actually does rate it as such. They give Teresa Greenfield about a 48% chance of winning here, and Joe Biden about a 45% chance. Some polls have actually shown Joe Biden leading what is a heartland red state. So I think Iowa is going to be very interesting. And this is a state that, more than anything, the reason it's so troublesome for Trump is because if they have to start dumping funds into Iowa, if Trump and the RNC do, then suddenly those funds are going into what's already supposedly a red state. They aren't going to Wisconsin, they aren't going to North Carolina, they aren't going to Pennsylvania, they aren't going to Florida, etc., etc., etc. So the more of these red states that Donald Trump is suddenly having to fiercely defend, the less funds he'll have to use on actual battleground states, states that he needs to win the election, in addition to the red states. And that's really a problem now more than ever, now that Joe Biden is actually out fundraising Donald Trump. So I'm going to leave the state of Iowa as a lean Republican, but this rating in and of itself is going to be very troubling for Republicans in terms of fundraising. So, moving over to another state that Donald Trump absolutely needs to win and is a red state, and that is the state of Ohio. This is a state that I'd previously characterized early on as a likely, then as a lean, and then recently as a tilt, and I'm keeping it there. Joe Biden has been leading in recent polling, although Donald Trump has still led a few. They've all been within the margin of error. I'm going to leave it as a tilt Republican just because Ohio is a red state at the end of the day. Sherrod Brown is the exception to the rule. But this is another state where if Republicans have to pour resources in, and this is going to be more expensive than Iowa, Ohio is a big state, then they are going to be sapped of resources for states that they need to win to get over the 270 barrier. Moving up into the Rust Belt, the state of Minnesota, I'd formerly characterized it as a lean, but Joe Biden has been leading polls by a lot here and a lot more than Hillary Clinton. Amy Klobuchar is going to be presumably on the ground, COVID allowing, campaigning for Joe Biden. I see no reason not to rate Minnesota at this point as a likely state. It should eclipse the 5-point threshold. And actually, despite Trump winning the state in 2016, same with Michigan. JHK actually gives Joe Biden at this point a better chance of winning Michigan than Minnesota, New Hampshire, or Nevada. All three of those are lightly blue states. Michigan is thought to be more of a swing state. Now, the polls that show Joe Biden leading here by 15, 16 points, don't believe those until they can have more consistent data out backing polls like those. But for now, this is going to be a state that I leave as likely Biden. Wisconsin, the same argument largely, but not as much. I'm going to leave it as a lean. And actually, Pennsylvania is very similar to Wisconsin. I'm not going to go over these states too much, aside from Minnesota and Michigan, because they're really much the same. Wisconsin's a little bit more conservative than the others. Moving down here, Virginia, another Bush state. It's much like Colorado. It's a likely now. But this is where it gets really interesting. South Carolina, I don't think it'll get over 15%. That's why I didn't mark it as safe. But Joe Biden shouldn't be competitive in the state. Things would have to really change. It would have to be a Biden landslide for him to even push it into the lean column. I'm leaving it as a likely. But down in Georgia, this one's much more troublesome for Trump. With polls indicating that black voters are going to be very mobilized. This one's going to be very competitive. I've talked about it more in detail in previous videos, but I'm going to categorize it as a tilt Trump. Moving down to the state of Florida, though, I know Rick Scott won here in 2018, but Rick Scott was a very strong candidate, and he was polling much better than Donald Trump. Joe Biden actually leads virtually every poll here, and at this point, I think it's time that I start to characterize it as a tilt Biden as opposed to a toss-up, or when the election cycle begins, actually a lean to Trump. North Carolina, same argument as Georgia, except it's more liberal. So I'm hard pressed to characterize this as anything but a toss up, or at least I was. But at this point, Joe Biden is polling better than he was, and I think this state is a tilt Joe Biden, at least at this point. And tilt, of course, means it will be won presumably by less than 1 point. Tilt is 0 to 1 points, lean 1 to 5, likely 5 to 15, and safe more than 15. So I'm leaving North Carolina as a tilt state. JHK does rate it as a leaner. Two more states to classify, the first of which is New Hampshire, likely to safe Senate race, and in terms of the presidential level, it's generally a very competitive state, but at this point, Donald Trump's approval rating is so far underwater here that I'm going to actually move this state from lean to likely categorization. The state of Maine is another one I've gone into great detail about, and it is a likely state at the presidential level. The second congressional district is becoming very interesting, though. The polls are virtually tied here, and I think that, again, Joe Biden won't need this if he can win the states I've given him here, or even lose one or two of them. But this is a state where Donald Trump should have been a lock, but at this point it's narrowed up a lot, and I'm going to move it from the lean to the tilt categorization, meaning less than 1 point. Alright, here is my electoral map as of June 22nd, 2020. The scenario where Trump wins is really the same as last time. Joe Biden only flips Michigan and Pennsylvania from 2016, but I really appreciate y'all's continued support, and I will see you guys on Thursday, where we'll discuss the 2024 Republican primary.